Let Me Tell You a Story is a product of Carolina Storyteller, starring Jonathan Phoenix, written, produced, and directed by Jonathan Phoenix, edited and recorded by Jonathan Phoenix, and horribly marketed by Jonathan Phoenix. Man, I gotta hire a staff. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Carolina Storyteller and subscribe to get exclusive content and all kinds of other neat stuff. We even have merchandise coming. Anyway, sit back and enjoy the show. Welcome back to Let Me Tell You a Story. I am Jonathan Phoenix, the Carolina Storyteller. It's great to have you guys back here. As you guys know, yesterday was Friday the 13th. And if you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, go check out the bonus episode me and Adam put together on the Friday the 13th horror series. It's a lot of fun. We're just having fun talking about a series of movies that I personally have enjoyed for years, and because my son enjoys slashers, he's starting to enjoy. So go check out me and my son bantering over Friday the 13th. Now, the reason I mention Friday the 13th is because with horror movies, particularly with slashers, there's always something that happened that gave somebody the idea. And today I want to talk about a grisly occurrence at a camp in Oklahoma that may have been the very thing that inspired the writers to write Friday the 13th. This grisly occurrence could have been the inspiration for a series of movies that has spanned almost 40 years, over 40 years. Anyway, let me tell you the story. It's coming right up. Anyway, let me take you back to 1977. Disco's still going. Bee Gees were probably on the radio, I don't know. Charlie Daniels hadn't released Devil Went Down to Georgia yet because I hadn't been born, so there wasn't a guy named Johnny down there to fight the devil. Long story short, I'll tell you about that one later. The Eagles hadn't even released Hotel California. Star Wars wasn't even out yet. In fact, they were still filming Star Wars at the time. And we're going to go out to Camp Scott, Oklahoma, which was a Girl Scout camp in the middle of June. June 13th, if I'm correct. It was a Friday. The girls were all gathered together. They were getting settled into the camps. And the tent number 8 ended up only having 3 girls in it. 1, 2, 3. Now, these girls were ages 9 to 11. And they were friends. And they were also happy to be there because this was a Girl Scout camp. So really, this was an overnight camp where the kids got to stay for like a week. And it was a reward for doing the things they had to do as a Girl Scouts, including selling the most cookies. So this was their reward. They got to come out there and stay for the week. And the girls are all getting settled into their tents. They're getting to know one another. And tent 8 was the last tent in a semicircle of tents. Each group had 8 tents, with the counselors being in tent 1 and the girls being in each tent going around in a semicircle, with tent 8 being roughly at the end of the semicircle, about 80 yards away from the counselor's tent. So just a rough semicircle. They all come out. There's a fire pit in there. All the girls get to sing Kumbaya, then they go back in their tents. You know how it is when you go camping. So these girls all do their thing. They tuck in for the night. And of course, it's the first night, so everybody's excited. So multiple times the counselors remember waking up and telling the girls, hey, quiet down. But they also remember seeing things that didn't make sense, like lights in the trees. Something that was moving off in the distance. And at one point, the girls in Camp 7 recall that their tent flap opened and a large man with a flashlight was standing there. He looked at them and then left. They thought it was weird, but nobody screamed, nobody threw a fit. It was just some guy. Maybe he was just making sure they were okay. This is the 1970s. We hadn't had a slasher flick yet to tell us how dangerous that was. You know, yes, horror movies teach us something. They teach us that people are bad. Fast forward to in the morning, the counselor comes out of their tent. And as they're getting ready to go to the showers, which is just off from where the tents are, kind of like centered around where all the groups of girls, they notice something strange kind of bundled up in the middle of the field. They make their way over to it, and it's sleeping bags that have just been kind of haphazardly tossed. And the first one is kind of half open, and it is the youngest of the three girls. She's been brutally murdered. The other two sleeping bags held the other two girls, also brutally murdered and assaulted. Of course, police are called, investigation starts. Everybody's trying to figure out what's going on. Because it's just this brutal, horrific thing. The camp is closed down. It never opens again. They've closed down Camp Scott. But the investigation just takes a weird toll. As the police get out there and they start looking around, the first thing they find is a bloody footprint. They find a bloody footprint on one of the sleeping bags. They find a bloody footprint in the tent where the girls were killed. They find other things like duct tape. And so they start to track it. Now, near this camp were these caves. And this is where things get really interesting, because as they're looking for these caves and searching for a potential murder suspect, they come across these caves that nobody really does anything with. You know, they're just caves. Not a lot of people know about them. But of course, you know, the professionals know. The professionals go and they get into these caves, and then they find all this evidence that someone had been staying in these caves recently. They find the same footprint in the mud. They find duct tape. They find rope. They find film from camera. They find all kinds of stuff. But what is most terrifying is probably the fact that they found a message scrawled in blood that literally said, "The killer was here. See you soon, guys." Now, if that's not I'm gonna run for the hills, I don't know what it is. And let me remind you that these murders occurred on June 13th, on a Friday. That's right, Friday the 13th. Now, while the movie may have changed the age of the children and may have changed it to being teenagers, it's no less strange that on this day, this already day that has an ominous thing about it, this man came out and attacked three girls, and nobody knew who did it. For months, there were investigations. There were investigations. There were accusations. They finally did get a suspect. But when they put the suspect on trial, well, for one, he was already in prison for something else by this time. But for two, after going through a several months long trial, he was acquitted. He was found not guilty. 20 years later, somebody would show back up and they would review the cold case and show up with evidence and point to three other suspects, saying that this wasn't the act of one person, but this was the act of several. And all of these suspects were originally associated with the first suspect. In fact, some of them were used to accuse the first. The case has never been solved. You know, to this day, these three young girls have never gotten justice for being brutally murdered at this camp. It is really a gut-wrenching and horrible story. And to think that, we all think of the Friday the 13th massacre must have been some crazy, slaughter of camp counselors, but no. It was the murder of 3 beautiful young girls at a Girl Scout camp in the middle of the woods in Oklahoma. This wasn't like upstate New York, or, South Carolina where you're expecting crazy people to be. No, it was Oklahoma. What happens in Oklahoma? Other than, Timothy McVeigh in the 90s, Oklahoma's not like... Really? Oklahoma had the Girl Scout camp murders? It's one of those things where it can happen in your backyard. It can happen anywhere. And it really did take a toll on the parents, not just of these children, but of children in the community, because their entire community was just uprooted. These parents had to wait the next day because they didn't know which little girls had been murdered. They just knew 3 girls were murdered. And so they're waiting as the bus is bringing these kids back, just hoping their little girl gets off the bus. Because the day before, they had put their little girl on the bus and sent them to this camp where they were supposed to be safe. Now, this was someplace where the kids were supposed to be safe. It was horrible as a parent, if you think about it, to sit there and have to have these feelings of dread, not knowing what has happened to your child in the midst of all this. Needless to say, 3 years later, out comes Friday the 13th, based off of the killings that occurred on Friday the 13th in Camp Scott, Oklahoma. Now, it's never really been confirmed that Camp Scott was the basis for the Friday the 13th movies. But given the similarities, yes, Jason does stray off a ways, but Friday the 13th as the date, camp that's supposed to be really nice, and murders. Thankfully they didn't make it a Girl Scout camp, and thankfully they didn't go into the gruesome and horrible details of this grisly case. But that just shows you that there's always a little truth in fiction. These movies that we watch, these horror movies that we watch, somewhere in there is a snapshot of somebody's lives. There's a snapshot of something that's going on or that's actually happened. And if you dig into it, sometimes the real story can really scare you. Anyway, that's my story for this week. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. As I said, please go check out me and Adam's bonus episode where we talk about Friday the 13th. Have a little bit of fun and levity after this, because this is really a dark one. Remember, go to carolinastoryteller.com. Get all your Carolina Storyteller stuff. Find out all the stuff about Let Me Tell You a Story. Check out all the information on my guests. The Metal Maidens are still out there, and they're still making it metal. Make sure you go and check them out. Check out Victoria J. Her book has been moved back. It's going to be November 27th, but I know it's going to be great. Pick up some merch. I've got merch coming up. Buy a couple of books. Listen to a couple of episodes. Give me a like and a review, and always remember to hit that subscribe button. Stay spooky, my friends. We'll see you next week.